everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming. My name is Ned Atkins. I'm a marketing producer at Upload. I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on the OZO Masterclass and how it came about. So as you guys may know, the mission of Upload is to accelerate the VR AR industry and to support the community wherever possible. With Nokia, they've created a truly world-class virtual reality camera, the Nokia OZO. So we decided to team up, pull in a couple of experts in 360 filmmaking, and put on a masterclass series with the purpose of inspiring the next generation of filmmakers to transition to this medium and to start to create and explore with it and tell stories in a whole new way that only virtual reality makes possible. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Alex Henning, the executive producer of Argos and the co-founder of Magnopus. Alex?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is really great. My name is Alex Henning. I am, as he mentioned, the co-founder of Magnopus, which is a content-focused AR/VR company located in downtown Los Angeles. And amongst other hijinks that we've been involved in, we were lucky to be involved in this particular project, which was called the Argos file. This is a project we did with outside filmmakers and that we collaborated with Nokia on specifically in order to produce a teaser for what's meant to be a 360 video-powered interactive experience. So what we're going to talk about today is basically what did we learn, what have we learned shooting with the Nokia OZO and shooting 360 in general. I'm going to try and cover a little bit all phases of production from pre-production all the way through post. There's a fair amount to go over, but I'm going to try and jam through it as quickly as possible so we can get to Q&A. And if you guys have any specific questions about either creative or technical or anything else, feel free to ask. Before we jump into that, I just want to tell a quick story, though, about the first pitch meeting that I ever sat in on for a 360 piece. This is about 3 years ago. It was down in Los Angeles. It was with a brand new VR company that I won't name, and fairly well-known director who I also won't name. But the director came in and he had a really amazing vision for something that he could do with 360 video. It was really exciting. But over the course of the meeting, the vision got whittled down by no or can't or won't or doesn't until it was pretty boring. And especially in those early days, that's a lot of what you would hear. You can't move the camera. You can't make cuts. You can only light it a certain way. All these restrictions that people were placing on themselves without actually having really tried any of this stuff to know if it was feasible or not. So when it came to the Argos file and working with Nokia, and when it comes to what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to try not to use those words. So if you have questions on something you're trying to approach in your own work, I try to be very solution-oriented, and I encourage you to do the same. All right. So starting with pre-production. And first thing that we had to tackle in pre-production was location. So what do you look for in a location when you're going to shoot 360 video? What are your considerations for your creative? What are your considerations for your practical? And by practical, I mean simple things like where's the crew going to hide while you're shooting? If you're going to use big lights, where are you going to hide them so that they aren't on camera? Things of that nature. From a creative standpoint, we were looking for 3 key factors in each location. Number one is that we had discovered early on in some of our testing that when shooting with a camera like OZO that gives you stereo both up and down, that working with expanded vertical space was a really powerful and really awesome tool. So one of the first things we looked for was, frankly, a tall location. We wanted to have things to look at well above you, well below you. Other things that we were interested in finding were areas where we could create framing. Because as you know from shooting 360, or perhaps you don't know if you've never shot it before, but there is no framing. There are no close-ups, there are no wide shots. It's what you shoot is what you get. You don't shoot coverage, really. So how can you create framing? Well, you can create it with your space. If you're coming out of a passageway or looking out of a window, things of this nature that create a physical framing within the space, you can still get the same type of result. So looking for those opportunities was definitely something we focused on as well. Just showing this picture because it is the most often used piece of equipment in our set kit, especially for scouts. It's a Gigapan with an SLR attached. I encourage you to go get yourself one if you're ever doing any of this 360 work, because you can hit the button and get a really high-res 360 and move on. So let's look at some of the locations we didn't use. This is the first one we scouted. As you can see, it had some nice vertical features. We had these stacked trailers. It had some color variation, some interesting texture. We had these power lines right above us, which we thought would have been pretty cool. Although I'll tell you right now, trying to stitch these power lines in this grid work would probably be fairly challenging and ultimately not such a great idea. This was a second location that we really, really liked. Similar in that it dealt with containers, but this one was actually in the stacks. This one was great because we have a bunch of vertical interest here. We have some confined spaces that open up into some larger spaces, which is something that's really, really fun and powerful to do in 360. Again, talking about that concept of framing. Putting the user in a confined space and letting them open up into a larger space is something that works really, really well. And as you can see, plenty of opportunities to hide big lights, crew, etc. This was a really great location, but in the end, nothing overhead, just blue sky, or in our case, night sky, because we're going to shoot at night. And so we kept looking. Here's another one. This was on at a loading dock in Los Angeles Port. Again, really great vertical features. We had a lot of fun ideas for things we could do here. Had a really, really nice view off to one side that we thought would have been really interesting. However, one thing that we figured out pretty early on shooting with OZO, or just shooting 360 in general, is that the resolution limitations on the sensor and the display both make it so that anything you have at any sort of substantial distance really just gets flattened out very quickly and ends up being a lot less interesting in the headset than it was to you when you were looking at it with the naked eye. So in the end, although we really liked this view, we realized that we weren't going to get much production value out of it in 360 when it was all said and done. So we moved on. Here's another spot that we checked out. Again, nice vertical features, a lot of stuff happening above you, happening below you, some framing opportunities here at the end. Here's what it looks like from the reverse. We had a plan to maybe do a shot coming out of that would kind of reveal this larger space. This was definitely in contention, but we scrapped it when we found this location. And this is where we ended up shooting. Those of you who have watched Westworld might recognize this. I was rather tickled to see them walking around in here when they go into cold storage to see what Ford is up to. Anyway, this was an abandoned mall in Hawthorne, and this was perfect. This was absolutely perfect for us because it was 2 levels, so we had all kinds of vertical to play with. We have all of this sort of built-in lighting production value, creating these amazing pools of light and creating depth off in the distance without us having to do much to get it. And it was just full of interesting features, nooks and crannies, places to hide, spaces to start in that would then open up into this larger mall space. And in the end, this was the location that we used for all those reasons. So let's talk about production design a little bit. So production design for 360, much like production design for a standard feature or commercial or whatever it is that you're working on, except that you really do have to consider that you're designing in all directions. You're not going to dress half a set. You're going to dress a whole set. So what does that mean? Lighting strategy becomes very important. Unlike some shoots maybe you've been on where every shot you're going to stop, you're going to relight. You shoot 360, it's more like working with a cinematographer who's just going to light the room and let it be that way, right? That's kind of the only way you can approach it. And I don't like to say don't a lot, but it's an approach that really makes a lot of sense. You have to address the entire space because you are going to see the entire space. So what was our lighting strategy? Something like this. We wanted to keep it dark overall because that's the mood we're looking for. One of the challenges, though, with shooting really any digital camera, but especially something like an OZO, or even, frankly, something like an Alexa or Red or anything like that, is once you get into the darks, it gets pretty noisy, you start to lose detail. So our approach for dealing with that was to, instead of using one or two sort of massive lights to light up our space, we're going to use 100 smaller lights so that we could create these pockets of interest in depth, both up and horizontally, and sort of give the camera some interesting pockets of light and shadow to move in and around in to define the space. Here's a look at what the upper level looked like and the lower level. See, we did a lot with color, but really just kind of doing these individual lights in pockets, right? Because again, working on creating depth, working on creating something believable for our party scene that would seem appropriate without a bunch of big stage lights there to kind of kill the idea and make it obvious that this is a shoot instead of a real thing. We also incorporated lighting into our costume design. Knowing that the actors would occasionally be in places that weren't well lit and knowing we still wanted to read their faces, we actually incorporated some lights into their costumes so that wherever they were, we'd be able to see their faces and read their reactions, see their lips when they're reading their lines, and so on and so forth. A couple other examples. Basically, we put lights on everything. That was our strategy. All costumes, all props, every corner, we put small lights. Here's another set that we used for our Mad Scientist lab. Again, you can see we got a lot of smaller, less intense light sources, right? Because we're not trying to end up with sort of a big, brightly or broadly lit wall. We're trying to end up with little pools and pockets. Again, anything that helps us create depth. Okay, so camera testing and preparation, very important. There's a lot that goes into shooting. And there's a lot that you really need to figure out before you start if you want to make the most of your day. Our first and foremost challenge was, how are we going to shoot a POV experience with this camera? How are we essentially going to attach this camera to a person and make that work? This is the first version of the rig. You guys are laughing. Oh no, just kidding. It is a joke. We did not use this. This is the actual rig. As you can see, the way we designed it is for the camera to essentially sit as close to the actor's eyes as possible. Now, you can't replace the actor's head with the camera, which is ultimately what you'd want to do. So what we did instead is we got it as close as we could, and then we solved the rest of the gap through costuming. But what's important about this rig is that none of the weight is on the actor's head, neck, or shoulders. That little helmet attachment is really just for stability and to keep the actor from turning his head too much inside of the rig. But all the weight is on the hips, with just maybe a little bit on the shoulders for extra support. So it was comfortable, it was lightweight. It was built by a great company in LA called Technoprops, who does this stuff for a living. And it worked out great for us. Actors were able to wear it for a long period of time without getting uncomfortable. We could get it on and off them very quickly. Ultimately, we rigged it up so that we could have extra power sources and breakout recorders just for safety and backup, really. And then you can get an idea of what we did here in costuming to get it the rest of the way. So you have this foam here that acts as an extra set of shoulders to raise the actor's shoulders up. Also helps to cast a shorter actor. Very important if you're going to do something like this. But you can see we raised the shoulders up, And then we add a scarf as part of the costume directly under the camera. So now, if you're in the headset and you look down, what do you see? You see the scarf. And you see the shoulders raised up to where they should be, and you buy it. It doesn't feel like your head is floating above where it should be. It feels pretty natural. The other thing worth pointing out here, and it looks so funny, right? But it works really, really well on 360. The other thing worth pointing out here is that all this stuff is exposed, but you can't actually see it. If you guys take a look at the OZO camera here, you'll see that there aren't any lenses on the back of the thing. So you have a little bit of a cone of space there where it doesn't pick anything up. So that's a great place to do any sort of attachment to your rig, any hiding of cables, things of that nature. If you just sort of trace a line off the back two cameras there, you can sort of see the cone in space where you wouldn't be able to see anything. So we took full advantage of that by kind of hiding the meat of the rig off the backside. Here's that same actor practicing stunts inside the mall. Held up really well for all that stuff. Okay, so the other thing that we got heavily into working with the camera in prep was, what are the limitations of the camera? Because realistically, there's always going to be a limitation no matter what camera you're using. So the key is not to sort of get stuck on those, but to figure out like a strategy in advance for how you're going to deal with it and how you're going to make all your shots happen regardless of that. The other thing you're going to realize is that every camera has certain strengths. Strengths of the OZO are the size, the weight, the fact that it's all global shutter. You can throw it around quite a bit. And the Nokia people are probably getting nervous hearing me say that. We didn't break any of them. But you can, it's a good camera to use if you're going to do moving shots because it's got a small profile, it's not that heavy. So again, we got sort of bolder and bolder in our approach to moving the camera around because that was one of its core strengths. The other thing I'd like to point out is it's very important to figure out your digital production strategy in advance. You should know how you're going to stitch, know what your editorial is going to be, know what your approach to sound is, know all of these things, and know how you're going to deal with the footage in terms of grading it for color, how you're going to approach sharpening it or denoising it, any of these things. These are all things you want to have experimented with before you get on set so that you're less worried about the things you know you can fix later and you avoid the things that you know will cause you drama because you weren't able to come up with a solution. This is what you're starting with, right? You got 8 fisheye cameras, 195-degree field of view. This is right off the camera. So what do you see? Well, we're overexposed compared to the final footage, right? We set an exposure level that was higher than what we wanted it to look like to bring more of the image into a sort of a noise-free, safer zone. What did we sacrifice for that? Can't really get any detail in the cores of these LEDs or fluorescence if I wanted to get it back, but I couldn't really think of a scenario where that's something we would want anyway. So that's a good sacrifice to make in the interest of getting more detail in the shadows to begin with, even if we're going to crush it all down later. And here's what you end up with in the end, which is 2 stereo lat longs, right? Left eye, right eye. So you're going to have to get from this to that. And before you go out and shoot this, it's very important to understand how to do that. Critical. So moving forward to production and filming. I'm just going to throw this out quickly because I've seen it fall apart on 360 sets. But you treat it like a regular set. Known chain of command, known roles, known responsibilities. It's very easy for a 360 set to feel unsupervised because when you're shooting, it kind of is, right? Everyone has to go run around the corner and hide. But what you can't let happen is that it actually becomes unsupervised. Everyone has to try just a little bit harder to watch out for safety, to make sure that actors are comfortable in being taken care of, all those things. It seems like something obvious, but it's worth pointing out just because I've seen it on past productions not getting the attention that it deserves. This is critical to getting through the day. The other thing is data management. Treat it like a regular film, do your slating, back everything up. Your data is precious. You're probably paying a lot on the day for your location, your actors, everything you got there. Last thing you want to do is kind of lose control of your footage later on and not really know what you're dealing with when you go to edit. All right, so something more fun. Making bad shots good, good shots great. This is ultimately the biggest strength of shooting with the OZO, is that you can live monitor in VR. You can see what you're shooting in an Oculus Rift headset while you're shooting it if you're tethered. And if you're not, you can quickly see replay in that same headset as soon as the take is done. This is everything. This is more important, I think, than any resolution or frame rate or any other consideration. The ability to see what you're doing in the headset is how you're going to end up with compelling content. Because I submit to you, isn't it better to have something that's perhaps a little lower resolution but really exciting than something super crisp and high res that I shot with like 8 red cameras, but I couldn't see what I was doing, so it's boring. This was the key for us in all our work, was being able to see what we were doing and make adjustments. On a normal 360 shoot, and this is actually from the OZO software, this is what you see by default, right? You see all the feeds from the various cameras. In a normal 360 shoot, this is kind of all you get. You never actually get beyond this. You're just looking at the fisheyes, and it's really, really hard to judge anything looking at fisheyes on a monitor. So here's the advantage with OZO. Here's one of our actors, and he's looking at his performance in the headset between takes, which is a very kind of postmodern image, I guess. He's watching himself in VR, acting in VR. That's very strange. Oh, another costume solution, phony beard right under the camera to extend the real beard, very effective. But again, everyone, you know, the costume designer, production designer, director of photography, director, everybody, actors, always getting to check everything in the headset and make decisions based on that. This is everything. So we're going to take a look at some shots from the Argos file. And we're going to throw it first to our broadcast audience to look at an extended clip.
And we're in.
Dude, are you serious? Come on. Oh, yeah.
What was in this file, Derek?
Come on.
Whatever we stole, it's not worth people dying.
Wait, what?
Derek! 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 God, you're not really fun crap. Send me! I thought you wanted to change the world.
Yeah, I used you so hard, okay? Sometimes good guys do bad things. It happens.
No, you're not a good guy. You're a joke.
What? Dude, hands off. Dude! Derek!
Okay, so let's take a look at some of these individual clips, and then we can talk about some of the adjustments we made, where the shots started versus where they ended up. So in this first one, this was really our opening shot. We have some stuff before this, but it's pretty much all CG. And this is kind of our introduction into the live action portion of the piece. So we're coming through a dark tunnel out into the main party space. Cue the lights. And then we come up and look over this ledge, which is a really nice moment. especially when stereoscopic. So here's an example of some stuff that we changed because we could see it in the headset on the day. On our very first rehearsal, we did not follow the other character out into the space. So how is that different? Well, it's completely different in the feel of it, in that you feel a little bit like you're being propelled forward, like somebody has their hand in your back and is pushing you into the space, because you're not sure where you're going or what you're looking at. We noticed also that when people were looking at those early takes, that they were really doing that headset thing where they just kind of look all over the place, instead of really focusing where we wanted them to look and allowing themselves to be guided. Well, why aren't they letting themselves be guided? Because they have no guide. So we added a guide. Instead of meeting that character as you enter the space, we decided to have him with you in the tunnel. It gave you someone to follow into the space proper. And this worked really well because now as a viewer, you know where to look. Well, I'm following that guy. He's talking to me. He's engaged with me. Now I have direction. Here comes the slide shot. And this is a lot more fun if you check it out in the headset, so I encourage you to do so. But here's another example. We have a bunch of action happening here with timing of extras and other actors, and trying to sort of make it as interesting as possible as you walk through this, right? And to make it feel purposeful. We did a ton of takes of that scene walking through the party, and each take was better than the last because we knew what we were doing. Now, I've done plenty of 360 shoots where we couldn't see what we were doing, and then you get into editorial, and then some of what you thought was going to be good is good, and some of what you thought was going to be good is pretty useless or just weak. So one of the real advantages here is you don't have that problem. You also don't have that excuse. It's got to be interesting because you saw it on the day. So again, one of the coolest things about shooting with this camera and this system is that ability. I'm going to do one more here. So this is a little fist fight action. Where you get punched and knocked down. The first few times we tried this, we were very gentle. We had the operator/actor remain almost entirely still, just because we thought all the sort of jostling and shaking would be really tough on the audience. But what we found is that it completely lacked energy and it felt phony. And it wasn't until later takes where we had the operator actually really get into his combatant, into his adversary there, that it started to come alive, and you as the viewer started to feel the energy that you would feel if you were in that fight. And surprisingly, nobody threw up, and hopefully none of you will as well. But again, this is something we adjusted take after take after take because we could see what we were doing. And therefore, we could find something out like, hey, it's actually okay to let him move around and to let him really get into the other actor. That's what's ultimately going to be a better shot. Another thing we learned, however, was that lateral movement really did make everyone sick. So we tried to restrict his aggressive actions to be dead forward or dead back. Because at the end of the day, that was what was most effective and sort of the most comfortable at the same time. Okay. So moving on to digital production or post-production. First, let's just talk very briefly about editorial concerns for working with 360 and a couple of things that you may not sort of factor in at the beginning, but I assure you are important. The first is depth editing. If you're going to shoot stereoscopic, and this goes for regular stereoscopic, not just 360, but if you're going to have cuts, where you place things in depth from shot to shot really matters, especially if you want to cut quickly. If you have something up close and then you have a quick cut and now the subject is very far away or your IPD is changing a lot between shots, it's extremely disorienting. And by the time somebody's brain is caught up to the visuals of what's happening, you've moved on to the next shot and they're completely lost. So something to consider is when you're arranging things in the edit, what can you do to sort of bridge those depth gaps in the edit to make it a little bit more comfortable? And this isn't necessarily about not making people sick. This is allowing people to follow your narrative, right? You're trying to put them in the best position to understand the story. If you confuse them too much, it doesn't really work. Although knowing that, if you want to confuse them, that is a tool you can use. So it can cut both ways. The second thing is y-axis editing. And what I mean by this is the y-axis is sort of pointing straight up and down through the body of the excuse me, the body of the camera. And what that ultimately determines is, where am I looking? What's forward? Okay? I've seen plenty of 360 work, and I'm sure many of you have as well, where maybe you have a cut or something happens and it's dead behind you, or dead left, dead right. But I was looking here, and then the next thing that I have to look at is over here. If there's a story-driven reason to do that, then fine. And there's many methods you can use, right, to call somebody's attention, including sound, including visuals. You can call somebody's attention to another part of the frame. But again, if you're going to be cutting quickly, people might miss things. So if you want to have sort of a more frenetic pace, a more action-packed experience like the one we were creating, it's very important that we went through our shots, especially when we were cutting from location to location, and we sort of rotate the sphere so that from cut to cut, if you were looking at the subject of the last shot, you're going to be looking at the subject in the next shot. So here's a very basic example of that. So we're looking at this actress. She's sort of the focal point here, and she's going to be the focal point of the next shot, but she's in a new location. Now, okay, she's just off center and now she's centered, right? But keep an eye on the pole over here and look how much it's shifted over. And I'm just pointing at what's dead back in our shot and how it's been rotated. So what I'm trying to point out is that in post, we actually rotated the image around quite a bit for her to end up in the center. Because this was a shot, the exterior, something that we did first, 2 days prior to actually shooting in the mall. And trying to actually, you know, have an actress hit that exact mark relative to the camera on the day is pretty tough. So we ended up rotating this shot to compensate. Make sense? Okay. Next up, stitching. Stitching's hard. You got a lot of options for stitching. The Argos file was stitched using a combination of Nokia's proprietary software, as well as a hell of a lot of Nuke and Kara VR, which is the Foundry's VR stitching tool set. You got to make a decision on whether you're going to go monoscopic or stereoscopic and what that means. It used to be a rule of thumb. I come from visual effects is my background. And it was always a rule of thumb when we were bidding work that if you're going to do stereoscopic on a film instead of mono, then there's certain multipliers across kind of all factors of post-production. And it's not 2 because there's 2 eyes. It's like 4 and 6 and 10. It's a lot. But there's so much production value in having done it. It's important to know, I think, before you even shoot what your finish is going to be, because it is going to affect decisions you make. Because if you're not worried about stereo, then you're not worried about stereo, and you're sort of freed up from making those decisions on set. If you are considering it, well, you got a lot more work ahead of you, but it potentially could end up being really great. But you got to be aware of what those challenges are going to be later on so that you address them as well as you can when you're shooting and in pre-production. So when you get into post, you have a fighting chance to get it all done and make it look good. It's important to remember that stitching is a technical process with creative decisions. All right? It's something you got to do. A lot of it's highly technical, but you're making a lot of creative calls along the way. So here's an example of that. Nokia software, as well as the Foundry software, if you give it OZO footage, it can make an entire stereoscopic 360 without using the top cameras or the bottom cameras. Because there's enough coverage from the other cameras that it doesn't actually need them. That's how much overlap there is. And that's great. And maybe you don't, maybe you just shot blue sky above and you don't really care about the top cameras, or maybe all that was under the bottom cameras was a tripod like this, and it didn't actually matter. But in our case, we've got a body and arms and an actor under the camera. So for us, we made a creative decision to actually favor the bottom two cameras in our stitch so that we could stare straight down the chest of the actor. This is sort of an example of the lat long sort of being rotated to look straight down. This is the view you get. Again, looks squirrely on a screen like this, but totally works in 360. Stitching preparation. There's a lot you can do to make your stitching go better, and a lot you can do to make your image just come across better at all levels of your production. There are some of the things that we did before we even started stitching. Multiple denoise passes at luminance levels, sharpening passes, artifact removals on highlights, fisheye lens vignette removal, also very important, makes stitching a lot easier. We also used Cara VR to do exposure matching between footage from the different lenses to get ourselves into a more homogeneous state before we start stitching. Okay? This is the extra mile that you go to end up with something really great. You don't have to do any of this, but I highly recommend that you do if you're trying to produce something that in the end looks as good and is worthy of all the time and effort that you put into it. Just to give you sort of an example of what the nuke scripts look like and just how many nodes are involved before you would actually even get to the point of doing a stitch. A lot of preparation. So let's move on to visual effects. We had a lot of visual effects in this spot. And again, as I said, my background is VFX. It's the background of a lot of people at the company where I work. So we were really excited to try sort of a wide variety of VFX challenges with the Nokia OZO and with this project. We had motion graphics, we had CG, we have set extensions, particle and fluid effects, digital environments. All can be done with 360 in stereo. Not for the faint of heart, but it can be done. Certain things are infinitely more challenging, like match moving. On the plus side, you got 8 cameras for reference, which is great. So if you got a little noise coming off, one camera in the track, you might be able to stabilize that out with information you're getting from another camera. But here's the tricky bit. You can't match move a stitch because it's a manipulated image. So you end up in a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation. Am I going to match move and then actually do a render for each camera and then try to stitch that together? Or am I going to render right into the stitch knowing that my match move might be a little funky and I'm going to have to work it out? I can assure you that we did a lot of both, depending on what the shot was. But let's take a look at some of the stuff. So here's an example. This is a plate that we shot off the top of our building in downtown LA that we were going to use for the boot up screen when the Argos interface crashes in the middle of the teaser. And so let's take a look at the finished work.
Memories. What makes you most you? Welcome to the Nemo by Argos.
Sorry.
Oh, watch out one more time. This is something that's not actually in 360 too complicated because we had more or less had a lock off. There are definitely some challenges putting the stereo back together, getting the various motion graphics elements to be seated in the right place. But again, starting with this plate, which is pretty dull, and ending up with something like this is a lot more interesting to look at. This is the kind of thing that you can do without, let's say, breaking the bank. So coming up, here's an example of a multi-plate shot. We have a scene at the end of the piece where you are suddenly in the body of a different character and you actually get to see yourself in the mirror. So in order to execute that shot, we had 3 or 4 different plates, including one from your POV, which means we're back in our body rig, right, with the fake beard underneath and all that fun stuff. And then essentially what you're seeing in the mirror is a goofy looking person with an OZO on their head. So then we also shot a reverse from the mirror perspective to get a reflection plate of the actor now unencumbered by technology and wearing full makeup. And then we added a CG drill bit, as we decided it was not a good idea to have someone with a real drill who couldn't see what they were doing, bringing it closer and closer to either their head or to the very expensive Nokia OZO. Let's take a look at the final shot.
This is someone else's memory. Wait. Oh, no. What the hell just happened?
So here's an example of some match moving, actually, because we had to do an object track on the drill. A little easier than doing a big moving camera shot, which is something else that we did. But not an unovercomable challenge, just a challenge. This was our most involved visual effects shot, and this is the concept drawing that we followed in order to get it done, which is the death of the main character towards the end of the teaser. So you know going in that the character dies, and you know that he dies from an overdose. So one of the things we did want to try and tackle in the teaser was to actually show that overdose hallucination as the character dies. So this was a fairly involved shot. We did bust out a green screen, and it felt like real visual effects as a result. We shot various clean passes and other things for the environment. And then we did a whole bunch of particle work and other hard surface stuff for the skeleton to end up with this final shot, which I'll show you now.
Whew. Let me see how far back I can rip.
Two different plates for the woman. Her face and head and shoulders was actually shot using a Blackmagic Ursa at 4K, extremely low noise, just to pull like a really great key against the green screen. But we still wanted to get the stereo effect of the arms being close to your body. So we actually blended between the Ursa footage and the OZO footage to put her together, and then used our OZO footage of the deep background to finish what's the sort of practical elements of the plate. Then we did sort of a positional track of where she was in space in order to place the skeleton and the various emitters for all the particles and stuff like that. And then it just took a whole lot of revisions to actually get it all to sort of work correctly and come together in the end. So as you can see, from pre all the way through post, there's a lot that goes into it, but it's not wholly different from shooting normally. It's just being aware of what those extra considerations are, and above all else, sort of being bold and understanding that you can fix some things later on that will sort of encourage you to be a little bit more aggressive and make your footage a little bit more interesting. One thing that I actually kind of glossed over, but I will point out, is if you guys pay close attention when you look at the lat longs, one thing you might notice sometimes is, besides just the poles shifting around and Y, we talked about that Y rotation, you'll also see sometimes that it looks like the actor's body is bobbing a little bit. This is because we stabilized the hell out of all of this in post to get rid of the natural motion up and down, the tilt you get from walking. Not wholly comfortable, but definitely something that you can stabilize out in post without too much effort. And the visual effects team would probably say it was plenty of effort. But it wasn't so much effort. That's my presentation. Thanks for listening. I'd really love to hear if any of you have any questions that I can answer about working with the camera. Again, I'm a pretty hands-on guy, from shooting to post to everything else. So whether it's technical, creative, or even financial, feel free to ask. I may just not answer the third. The stereo that we got was essentially a sort of combination of slit method and warping. You know what I mean? So you are using all of the cameras to generate a left and a right plate. And in certain cases, you're kind of telling the software, or you're either by hand sort of saying, you must use this portion for this left eye, you must use this portion for this right eye. We did change it here and there. That's actually an important thing to notice about the OZO, is that the IPD is close to that of a human, but it is bigger. Realistically, it's about 50% bigger. Human IPD is around 2.5 inches, depending on your eyes. The OZO is about 3.5, something like that. Somebody from OZO could correct me on that. But it's an important consideration, because one of the things that we tried to do in this piece was to get people really danger close to camera. We wanted all these intimate moments. But what happens when your IPD is that wide is it just kind of doesn't quite work when you get into stitching. So in certain cases, you're going to have to throw one of the eyes out essentially from the footage and just kind of generate your own from a single lens, because the cameras see too different of an image for it to ever really resolve.
So I watched the demo of the teaser, and the part where you go down the slide was really impressive to me. Like, I didn't feel any kind of nudge or anything. Did you use any tricks to make that work better?
That's because you're looking at the after version. If I put you in the version that came right off the camera, you'd chuck. It's not good. Essentially, because the guy's wearing, this gear, and as sort of uncumbersome as the rig is, he still, to get himself onto the slide, had to do this, and that's really not good. Because again, he's rotating, and he's taking agency away from you, the viewer. Very uncomfortable. So if we were to go back through that shot, and through the power of Keynote, why don't we? Let's see. Here we go. So the slide. Look how much the pole was shifting there at the beginning, and even throughout. And that's all because we're doing a y-axis stabilization to get rid of all that panning and keep it facing straight ahead. So yeah, we stabilized it a lot in order to make it livable. And I think probably that's the shot that Nokia was the most nervous about. Yeah.
How much of this is real time versus produced? In the sense, there's a lot of content, great content here. Does latency has any effect on the performance on the device, or maybe this is probably not a related question, but I'm just curious.
Are you talking about lag that you would experience while monitoring it?
Yes.
There is a lag of a few seconds. So you're not going to be able to watch in the headset and then sort of call out cues as things are happening, because there is a little bit of a disconnect.
And that's because of network latency, or why is that lag?
That's a Nokia question, but I would assume it just has something to do with processing the footage from the camera and getting it sort of put back together to view on the headset. It's a lot of operations taking place at once.
Cool. Thanks.
No problem.
Hi, so I have two questions. In fact, one is about the frame rate of the demo. Is the final movie like 90 frames or 60 frames? I don't know if you can hear me. Is the final demo like 90, 60 frames or 29?
Got it. So the camera captures only at 30, or at least when we used it, it only shot at 30. I think that's still the case. Anyone at Nokia nodding? Yes. Still shoots at 30 frames per second. So this is 30 frames per second.
Okay, and then the second question is, the whole movie is produced for watching in VR, but how much of the production required you to use the headset itself? Like, when the headset was useful in the production process?
Like, when are we using the headset in production versus when are we just letting it go?
Like, you mentioned that the actors watched their play in the headset, right? But have you used the headset itself for anything else during the production?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, look, we use it, you kind of need to live in it, right, in order to do this stuff correctly. You got to be checking your edit in the headset. You got to be checking all your post work in the headset. I worked on a music video project a couple years back, where we kept getting feedback from the director that the sort of singer was too small in the frame. And we kept getting that note. And I'm like, this guy's crazy. Like, you can't even see the singer all at once. You gotta like crane your head up to see his face. Gotta crane your head down to see his toes. Like, what is he talking about? And then we realized he was never actually checking any of the work in a headset. He was just looking at the lat long, which is really not representative of what it's gonna feel like later on. So I would say you really gotta be checking in the headset from start to finish if you want it to turn out well.
Hey, so you mentioned that the OZO tapers to mono in the back, right?
Correct.
And watching the teaser, I really liked what you guys were doing with kind of the barcode motion graphics-y type approach to kind of cover that up. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So it was the sort of reason for that was largely creative in that you're supposed to be reliving someone else's memory. And it doesn't really make sense that they would remember things clearly that they couldn't see. So we were trying to come up with some effect that would kind of like degrade the quality of the memory as it got away from the forward pole. But the other thing that allowed us to do was to create a stereoscopic effect on top of that mono background and keep the entire thing stereo. It's also worth pointing out too that a lot of times when we work in 360 video, especially if you're doing something that's 100% CG, a very common approach is to taper the poles up and down off to mono. And the reason for that is simple. If I'm stereo here and I'm stereo here, I'm fine. But as soon as I tilt my head, now what? Things that were left, right are suddenly top, bottom, and it completely breaks and doesn't work anymore. So it makes a lot of sense that you would want to go mono below or above, because again, here I'm fine, here I'm not. So if I was over here and I look up, now the image doesn't resolve and it hurts my head. We made the choice though to keep it stereoscopic above and below, because for us, again, that vertical depth, that vertical sense of depth was one of the more powerful tools we found. So we decided to just basically deal with that and just let it be.
Question, please. This relates to your scene at the waterfront with the cranes in the background.
Mm-hmm.
And you were saying that at a certain point, the depth of field disappears. So with regard to the workflow involved in making something stereo, at what point does this trade-off disappear? And you say, if you're going to be shooting things that far away, just do it mono.
Right. So does everyone understand how stereoscopic works, more or less? Like when you put on a headset, you're not actually in a three-dimensional environment. You're being fed one image for your left eye, one image for your right eye. Stereoscopy is created by the separation of features horizontally, right? It's just a shift. It's here from eye to eye. So essentially, if you look at like your standard issue VR headset, like a Rift or a Vive or even like a phone-based one like a Gear, there's a certain point at which the resolution is just not fine enough to describe additional depth, right? And that's ultimately what it comes down to. It also comes down to, though, the fact that you're not necessarily going to change IPD that much from where the camera is to begin with. One of the tricks that we use in stereoscopic films all the time is if we're doing a big, wide establishing shot and we want to feel like there's tremendous depth even off in the far distance, we'll artificially jack up the interocular distance to like some ridiculous amount, like 15 or 16 inches. Because if I were a giant with my eyes that far apart, I would continue to perceive depth at that distance. So to answer your question, what you could do to manipulate that is to simply further offset things in the back in one eye to sort of fake it. But that obviously is going to have repercussions rolling forward, right? When you're dealing with your things that are up close, because if you shift one thing, you got to shift everything or it falls apart. So what you could actually, I mean, if you had a shot and there was nothing close to you and you wanted to create those additional layers of depth, then you would simply need to just shift things from one eye to the other, which is a pretty simple procedure. It's just move it horizontally in the stitch, and then you could create that additional depth. Hello.
Hi. I wanted to ask, what do you think is in the foreseeable future that you want 360 cameras to improve upon? I mean, you're talking a lot about obviously the issues that you have to deal with, create on a technical level, but like to help you on a creative side, you need these things to just be straightened out so you can just think of it. What do you? What are you seeing in the foreseeable future that's gonna enable you to be a better creative director?
I want it all, baby. I mean, look, a lot of the limitations that you might see today won't exist tomorrow. We all know this. This is the curve of technology. The resolution will triple and quadruple. The frame rates will go up. It'll all get better and better and better and better. Ultimately, I think what we're all looking for is options. You know what I mean? Because you want to be able to make as many creative decisions as possible. So I think that as the OZO matures, other 360 cameras mature, ultimately what you're looking for are like sliders and knobs and dials. Because you want as much control over the image as you can possibly get, as opposed to just being able to adjust one or two key components. So flexibility, probably the number one.
I have a question about that third topic.
Sure.
Did you guys estimate this out at a cost per shot or per minute, or how'd you do that?
Haphazardly? No. Yeah, it did. We had a budget that we were trying to stay in. And you only have so much butter and a lot of bread to cover. So you do your best to make the butter cover all the bread. But we did go do a traditional visual effects bid, for instance, where we went shot by shot by shot with our VFX crew and our VFX supervisor and estimated the work out. Just again, treat it as much like a regular production as possible. There you go.
Wondering if you could talk about some of your favorite live-action storytelling experience that you've seen that was created by someone other than you.
I think the most powerful stuff that I've seen in 360 is actually live broadcast or news related. To tell you the truth, I think that's where the medium really has the most impact. You know, I did a couple of the experiences where you're like in the Syrian refugee camp. That's powerful stuff. It's very, very powerful. The difference between seeing that isolated in a rectangle at the end of your room versus being surrounded by it and not really being able to escape from it. I think that while everyone is sort of figuring out narrative, there's already a huge impact to be made with live broadcast, and especially live broadcast of important current events. So that's the stuff that, to me, I've been the most impacted by.
I had a question about the audio. Did you end up doing like ambisonic or, you know, just straight stereos track? And then also, did you use any of the onboard mics on the Nokia, or was it all external mics, sort of thing like that?
So we did use the onboard mics, mostly for reference, to place things later on. But we did individual stems, you know, for like every actor and sound effect and things like that. So we did it sort of a very traditional, you know, wire all of your actors, place mics around the set in key locations, and then sort of rebuild it later. But one thing about having the mics on board was it made it a little easier to place those things in space later on. It gives you a really good frame of reference. But if you're trying to get production quality sound, you have to use production quality equipment. And having a single source of microphones, no matter how good they are, at camera is not going to get you what you get if you individually mic sources. 2 big ears? No. We did a 5-1 mix because that's for the Nokia playback system. That's what you give it in order for it to process out the ambisonic. For the actual piece, when we add the interactivity, we'll be doing that stuff most likely in Unity and let the game engine handle the sourcing.
What's your post timeline, and how do you determine that in pre-production?
Our post timeline?
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you that we underestimated how long the stitching was going to take.
As always.
You know, you do your best to bid it out And then if your producer is good, as ours was, she padded the hell out of everybody's estimates to give us a realistic timeline. Aside, you know, sort of apart from everybody's very, shall we say, optimistic early estimates. But yeah, I mean, same thing. We even did some storyboarding. You know, we used all the sort of traditional creative mechanisms to really plan this thing out in advance to have a good idea of what we were going to try to do. Now, we ended up doing a teaser as opposed to, like, let's say, a whole episode of the piece. So what format that was ultimately going to take on, you know, ends up being a little less than maybe what we originally anticipated, but it also ends up being a little different. And that's just the nature of this stuff, right? You kind of find what you're doing in editorial, and then everyone's got to redo their estimates. So this was no different.
So there's obviously, I think there's a very serious resolution issue on the viewer side, not so much on the shooting, the production side with the camera quality. So how do you guys think about resolution and how you manage that for the viewer? You obviously can't have fine print text right now.
That's right.
There's a lot of detail. And how do you sort of navigate that? Are you filming for content that can be evergreen for when that resolution does catch up to with the camera shooting it, or do you try to shoot for what's going to look good now or some?
Great question. So we're throwing a lot of text at you in this piece, but we aren't expecting you to really read much of it, right? It's visual. I don't want to say noise because that makes it seem random, and the text isn't random. But it's not critical to your understanding of what's happening to read everything. And that's because reading, as you just described in the headset, is a pretty poor experience overall, with the resolution being what it is. It's also just like kind of a waste. Why am I like strapping something to my face just so I can read text? Seems like overkill. But there's already quite a lot of people sort of coming to market right now with video playback technology specific for 360 that is enabling them to increase the resolution quite a bit. Now, you're always going to have a limitation on the display, or you know, your headset has a field of view of 110 degrees and X pixels across. You're not going to be able to beat that unless you have new hardware. But even from a software perspective, most 360 stuff you see now is not actually taking full advantage of the resolution that the device could display for that field of view. So now what you're getting is like foveated streaming and a whole bunch of other things that will actually give you wall-to-wall resolution everywhere you're looking. And some of those issues become less important. Okay. Anybody else? Oh, one more.
Hi. So going from like 2D narrative to this new medium, as a director, how does it affect timing and blocking and storytelling opportunities?
Well, it affects it quite a bit, obviously. I had a really fun moment with an old friend who I've worked with a lot, who came to our shop to put together a pitch for an interactive VR experience for a car company. And he comes from a very traditional filmmaking background. He blocked out his shots. He had his camera moves. He had his establishing, moving to a closer shot, all these things. Built it all for him. The people from the agency came over and put on the headset, and the first thing they did was start to do this. Because if you work with ad agencies, that's how you know they're serious about VR, is they look in all directions to show you that they know that there's stuff to look at back there. But my friend, the director, was freaking out because he's like, yeah, you're missing everything. And later we went out to lunch and he said, well, how do I stop them from doing that? And I'm like, you can't. You can encourage them not to, but you can't stop them. He's like, well, could we just make it so they can't rotate? I'm like, yeah, but then it's not this anymore. Now it's some, you know, it's what it used to be. It's not this new thing. You have to kind of accept that the agency exists. So to answer your question on like where I think it's going with narrative, I actually think that interactivity is a big part of that. And building in a little bit of, you know, gatekeeping or other mechanisms where the user can kind of express when they're ready to move on and they're done exploring the space. Because that way maybe you can get a little bit of better idea that they've seen what they're supposed to see in each scene. But other than that, you're just using a lot of the same methods, but in different ways. You're using light and shadow to create focus, right? You're using sound to draw attention. You're doing whatever you can to point people in the direction where you want them to look, but the medium is look anywhere. So ultimately, you have to accept that that's how it is and design to that.
Yeah, so from the creative perspective, when you talked about how documentary really lend itself, because the narrative is kind of built into the situation. You don't really need to think about, you know, why is this in VR, which is really an important question when you're trying to kind of come up with a story, right? You don't want to take something from 2D and replicate that. You want to think of a situation. So from the creative perspective, what is the range of stories that you think can be recreated, that could be told in 360 or in VR, that really lends itself well? Because I find, I see many documentaries that really work well. I see many horror stories that really work well. It's really easy to kind of throw a cat at you and scare you, or a scary clown. I haven't seen any comedies. I haven't seen any action movies that really are incredible. With you guys, this makes total sense because you are the person. Can you tell a story when you're not the person or the animal, or can you be a fly on the wall and still make a compelling narrative?
I believe that you can. It's just a different kind of story. I mean, again, like I think people are just starting to scratch the surface of what they ultimately could do with the medium. You know, the answer is, I don't know, go try. Let's see if it works. Again, like where I've been leaning more as a creative person is that adding some layer of interactivity is very important. I feel like the medium really wants you to do that. And it's very powerful. It doesn't mean you have to, though. I've seen plenty of sort of passive 360 stuff that I think is pretty good, but, you know, at the end of the day, you're right. You can't just adapt or dimensionalize something into 360 that wasn't designed for it and end up with something good. You do have to think about it.
Hey.
Hi.
So I don't come from a filmmaking background. I come from an interactive design background. And I'm looking for metaphors outside of film that are instructive. And I'm seeing things like walking tours through cities or museum tours to point to that interactivity. Are there any other metaphors you're aware of?
For interactivity?
Yeah, for what the future of 360 video can become.
Ah, got it. Well, our approach is 360 video is one tool, right? It's something that's at your disposal to create a larger experience. You aren't stuck with just that. If you decide to work just within those confines, that's up to you, but you don't have to. It can just be one component of many. We've already done plenty of stuff that uses 360 video within a game engine so that you can add layers and layers of interactivity on top of that. Once you're in that space, you can pretty much do whatever you want. You guys will have to forgive me, without my glasses on, like past the third row, it just falls off to darkness, so I'm not sure who's raising their hand.
We just have time for one more question.
Okay, so I now, like the whole idea of VR movie is that it's about you, like you're in the movie, right? And the presence. So have you thought about the fact that now you just, like in classic movie you have some primary actors and the actors in the background doing, I would say, noise, right? Now you can have primary actors all around you because you don't know where the viewer will look around. So there should be some roles that you should pick up if you will look right. Like if you won't follow the path that narrator wants you to follow. And have you thought also about the costs of the future movies where you need to like stage everything around the camera, not only up front? It's similar to games when you need to model all the stuff in the scene, but at the end of the day, player will just run through it, shooting and not looking at all that stuff. So have you thought about all these costs and future, how to say, problems that the new medium gives you?
Well, first of all, I don't think traditional filmmaking is going anywhere. I think it'll continue to be with us because I think it's a tremendously powerful narrative device, as evidenced by how many people still go just watch regular movies, regular TV. Your question, though, reminds me of footage I've seen of heat mapping on a cinema screen, something they do with marketing, where they actually do eye tracking and see where people were looking at the screen. And as a former visual effects artist, I can tell you that it's really irritating that nobody looked at that explosion on the far left that I did like 800 versions of, that they only looked at the actor's eyes. But that's the lesson, isn't it? Where are you going to look? You're going to look at people's faces. More often than not, you're going to look at their eyes. So when you talk about dressing the entire 360, if I don't give you people there, you can be obstinate and just stare in that direction if that is your choice. But most people are going to stick with your main characters because they're going to be talking and because you're going to want to look at their faces. That's where people tend to look. That's what that all has sort of taught us over the years. So I think in terms of, needing to design a narrative in all directions, the narrative can be straight ahead. You need to design the environment and everything else in all directions for VR. But where the narrative goes is what's appropriate to your story. Maybe it's completely straight ahead and then it turns left. But those momentum changes are also like powerful things. Like in Argos, we were trying to essentially throughout the course of the teaser keep you propelled forward. That's kind of our momentum that we build. But at the end of it, we rewind you backwards through the whole thing. But you can start thinking about these movements as narrative devices that you can use. Maybe I was going this way, now I'm going this way. All right, well, if I'm backing up, should I still be looking forward or should I turn around and look the other way? These are all just choices, right? So you aren't necessarily obligated to do a million branching storylines that exist in every direction, but you certainly could.
Hey, I want to give a big round of applause to Alex Henning from Magnopus. Thanks, Alex. Great work. Just a couple notes to end up. We do have the Argos file loaded up on the headsets in the back. I hope you'll take the opportunity to look through and see what the Magnopus team put together for that project. It'll also show the live feed from one of the cameras here. Please do stick around. Those of us from the OZO side are going to be around for a little while yet. Come ask questions. If you're interested in the live production, we'll turn on the lights back here, and the live guys will be happy to talk you through. Please don't crowd the room, but maybe take turns, and you can check that out. And then on Thursday night, we're doing an encore presentation here of Live 360 with Alex from Vantage TV and Megan Slankard, a local performing artist, who will do a live 360 broadcast of a music show. So please come see us on Thursday. Thanks again, Alex. Thanks to the Upload VR guys for the space. And thanks to you all for coming. Good night.